my friend. Welcome to your sleep story. My name is Stephen Dalton. I'm an Irish storyteller, and it's my great privilege to be the voice that you listen to as you go to sleep tonight. Tonight I continue my boring series in which we learn about incredibly boring people or places, or sometimes both at the same time. And tonight's story is a case in point. We will visit the most boring hotel in the world. We will learn about its boring staff and its incredibly boring guests. And hopefully it's just the right amount of humor and boringness to put you to sleep with a smile on your face. I really hope you like it. Okay, let's do the relaxation session first, which will take a few minutes before tonight's sleep story. I'm going to count down from 10 to 1. And as I do, allow yourself to let go more and more. 10. Feel the support of the bed beneath you, or the floor, or whatever you lie upon tonight. And beneath that, feel the constant support of the earth. For this support is always there. The support that our home, the earth, gives to us. And as you become aware of that support, see if you can let go a little more now. Release anywhere you might be holding. A little more now. 9. You are safe. Tonight, allow my voice to be a friend, to be a guide that takes you towards comfort, towards peace, towards escape and letting go. Know this, that my voice will only ever take you to safe places, kind places, places of wonder and magic. 8. The day is done. Whatever has been, has been. Whatever will be, will be. So whatever thoughts you might be having tonight about the past, about the future, know that they are not useful right now. Don't try and fight them. See them for what they are. Thoughts, not you, separate from you. Things that you can easily let go of right now. So as they arrive, see them, and then watch them go, like leaves on a moonlit river, or clouds passing by. within you. It is always there. It is a constant friend. It is just waiting to be found, waiting to be felt. So tonight, see if you can find that peace that lives within you. Allow that peace to be a source of comfort tonight. To let it glow gently within you. And to pass throughout your body. Allowing your body and mind to relax and let go now. 6. This is your moment. This is your time. You deserve rest. You deserve peace. We all do. Allow that fact to enable you to let go more and more now. To ease into this very moment more and more. 5. You don't have to carry anything anymore. You have nowhere to go. Nothing to do. In this moment, you are free. This is your time. Luxuriate in that fact. Find the coziness in that fact. 4. Perhaps allow a little gratitude now. Gratitude for the simple things. The shelter you have tonight. Those you love. The breath in your body. 3. Begin to engage with your imagination now. Begin to see an incredibly boring looking building. So boring, you wouldn't even know it was a hotel. But it is. And it's raining. And you're about to hear of the incredibly boring lives that exist behind these boring-looking walls. 2. Checking in with your body one more time now. Your body has worked hard for you today. It's time to give it rest. And 1. Completely letting go now. As I tell you tonight's sleep story. The hotel sat quietly on its patch of road, a little back from the pavement. as if it had chosen to be polite about taking up space. Its windows were all exactly the same size, and exactly where you would expect them to be, lined up in rows that made the whole building look faintly serious. The curtains inside the windows were the same neutral shade from one end of the building to the other, and they hung, so it was still hard to imagine anyone ever opening or closing them. The sign above the entrance simply read "Hotel," followed by the name of the street, as if it wanted no confusion about what it was or where it could be found. The letters on the sign had faded a little over the years, but remained clear enough to do their job. The car park out front contained a sensible number of spaces, most of which were usually occupied, though you rarely saw anyone actually getting in or out of a car. The entrance doors were the sliding kind, and they always seemed to take just a moment longer than you expected before opening. Never dramatically late, just enough to make you pause. Inside, you could just make out the shape of the reception desk, the neat little bowl of mints, and the faint, warm glow of the lamp that sat there year-round. Everything about it seemed to say, very gently, "This is fine." The hotel was run by a man named Kenneth. Kenneth had been the manager for 12 years, though if you asked him how long he'd worked there, he would have to stop and think. He had the sort of face that looked like it had been designed to nod politely. His hair was always combed in the same direction, as though it had been told once what to do, and had never questioned it since. Working alongside Kenneth was Angela, who did most of the check-ins. Angela had perfected the art of handing over a key card without saying more than 3 words. Her tone was pleasant, but unchanging, as though she had recorded herself once and was simply playing it back every time. She kept her hair in a neat bun that never seemed to loosen, even after a long shift. There was also Martin, who worked nights. Martin enjoyed the night shift because it was the one time he could be sure nothing much would happen. His job consisted mostly of sitting behind the desk and listening to the hum of the vending machine, occasionally getting up to walk the corridor, just to make sure the corridor was still there. The housekeeping staff were a quiet pair named Irina and Mirella. They moved through the hotel at a steady pace, carrying fresh towels and nodding to each other at regular intervals. They rarely spoke to guests, unless asked something very specific, like, "Do you have an extra pillow?" To which the answer was always yes. Paula oversaw breakfast. She moved at the same pace every morning, quietly lining up cups and setting out plates until the whole room looked ready to serve its purpose. Her eyebrows did most of her talking. A slight lift to indicate fresh rolls had arrived. A small dip if the coffee machine was slower than usual. Christy was the chef, a man who liked to keep things predictable. His kitchen ran on a kind of gentle rhythm, chopping, stirring, tasting. He had exactly 3 dishes he was known for, and anyone who requested anything outside of that would receive one of the 3 dishes anyway. Victor was the handyman, though you would only ever see him if something had broken, and even then, only briefly, before the thing in question was fixed, and Victor had vanished again. He seemed to know when a light bulb was about to flicker, before it actually did, and appeared almost magically to replace it. And finally, there was Loredana, who worked in the laundry room at the back of the building. No one was quite sure how she always knew which guests had requested extra towels before the requests were even made. But she did. When she spoke, it was in a quiet voice that carried perfectly through the linen room. Now, I'll describe to you what a day in the life of the most boring hotel in the world looked like. At 6:43 a.m., Martin wrote the words, "Quiet Night," on the only sheet of paper he'd used in 8 hours. He did not add a full stop. It seemed too final for that early in the morning. placed the pen back in exactly the same groove on the desk, or it would wait patiently until the next night. Then he stood, stretched just far enough to make his back click once, and put on his coat. At 6:49 a.m., Kenneth arrived. He gave the lobby a slow glance, the kind of glance you give a room when you expect it to look the same, and it did. He shook out his umbrella from the rain outside, and took off his rain jacket and hung it on a coat stand. Then he urgently walked to the stack of brochures and pressed them with the flat of his hand, straightening them until the edges lined up like obedient soldiers. Someone had taken one about 2 weeks ago, and he wanted to be sure they were ready for the next person who might be interested. Then he rotated the bowl of mints 1/2 inch, so that the most colorful wrapper was at the front. Satisfied, he nodded to Martin. Martin nodded back, handed him the paper, and left without saying another word. At 6:55, somewhere far down the corridor, the first faint sound of Paula setting up breakfast reached the lobby. It was the soft clink of cups being placed exactly an inch apart. A moment later came the distant sigh of the coffee machine, as though the whole thing was working up the will to face another day. At 7:02, Christy appeared briefly in the kitchen doorway, holding 2 pans in one hand, and considering which one deserved to be used first. After a moment's thought, he chose the heavier one, placed it on the hob, and stood perfectly still until the extractor fan made its usual first cough of the morning. At 7:10, Irina and Mirella wheeled their trolley along the upstairs hallway. The squeak in the front wheel was slightly louder than yesterday, which meant Victor the handyman would appear sometime this afternoon, not once, and fix it without breaking stride. At 7:15, Angela arrived, her shoes tapping out a rhythm that was by now as familiar to Kenneth as the ticking of the lobby clock. She put her bag under the desk, smoothed her bun with one precise movement, and took her place behind the computer, as though continuing a conversation she had been having with it yesterday. By 7:20, the hotel was fully awake, or at least as awake as it ever got. The brochures were straight. The coffee was nearly ready, and the first guest would appear soon, shuffling sleepily towards the breakfast room, ready to supply the hotel with the one thing it existed for: a reason to keep doing this all again tomorrow. At 7:28, the first sound of movement came from the staircase. It was the slow, deliberate shuffle of slippers on carpet, followed by the faint clearing of a throat that suggested someone was coming, but wasn't in any hurry to arrive. A moment later, Mr. Ellis appeared, a man who had been staying at the hotel long enough to be on first-name terms with the breakfast buffet. He made his way to the same table he always chose, the one near the radiator, but not too near, and sat down without glancing at the menu. At 7:34, the first couple arrived, Mr. and Mrs. Finch. They entered together but said nothing to each other, as though the act of arriving at breakfast had been thoroughly discussed in their room and required no further comment. Mr. Finch carried the room key in his hand, even though he wouldn't need it until he went back upstairs. Mrs. Finch glanced once around the room, nodded almost imperceptibly, and then sat at the same table they had used the day before. At 7:41, a young couple came in. They walked to the buffet together, taking it in turns to look at the bread rolls, as if they were choosing a pet. After a long pause, they each took one and returned to their table, looking faintly accomplished. At 7:47, the businessman appeared. He walked straight to the coffee machine, pressed the button twice, and stood perfectly still until it finished. Then he picked up the cup, sipped, and gave a small nod to himself, a nod that seemed to say, Yes, this will do. He sat down at a table close to the door, as though he might leave at any moment, though he never actually did until breakfast was over. At 7:53, an elderly lady arrived, holding her handbag in both hands, like it contained something very precious, though it almost certainly did not. She chose a table by the window, placed the handbag on the chair opposite her, and patted it once, as though reassuring it that it could stay there. At 8 o'clock, the mother and her young son came in. The boy immediately pointed to the cereal, then to the juice machine, then to the empty chair he wanted to sit in, all within about 3 seconds. His mother followed behind, carrying her plate, as though it was a slightly risky experiment that she hoped would succeed. And finally, at 8:07, an older man arrived alone. He moved with the kind of quiet care that suggested he did not wish to disturb anything in the room, including the chairs. He chose a table in the far corner, placed his napkin on his lap, and sat completely still for a moment before beginning to think about what he would like to eat. Mr. Ellis was the first to move. He approached the toaster, selected one slice of bread, and stood watching it toast with the kind of focus usually reserved for major life events. When it popped up, he inspected both sides carefully, turned it over in his hand, as though considering it from every angle, and put it back in for exactly one more cycle. He did this every morning, and every morning the result was exactly the same. Mr. and Mrs. Finch sat in silence until Mrs. Finch said, "Jam?" Mr. Finch nodded and passed her the small dish, though she had already reached for it. He then folded his napkin precisely in half, before placing it on his lap, an action he repeated after every sip of tea, as though the napkin might have changed shape in the last 30 seconds. The young couple whispered to each other about the cereal choices, agreeing first on cornflakes, then switching to muesli, then deciding to have one bowl of each and share them. When they sat down, they swapped bowls twice before choosing which one to eat from, ending up with the exact same arrangement they had started with. The businessman finished his coffee, stood, refilled the cup, and returned to his table without changing his expression. He opened a small notebook, stared at a blank page for several minutes, then closed it again with a look of faint satisfaction, as though a decision had been made. The elderly lady stirred her tea slowly, not because it needed stirring, but because it was something to do. She then placed the spoon on the saucer, moved it half an inch to the left, considered this carefully, and moved it back. She patted her handbag once, nodded slightly, and began buttering her toast with the air of someone who had just solved a puzzle. The boy dropped a small amount of orange juice on the table. His mother reached for a napkin, but the boy got there first, dabbing at the spill with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for painting. When he was done, he held up the napkin proudly and announced, "Fixed it," to no one in particular. In the far corner, the older man was now buttering his toast. He took so long over the process that by the time he had finished, the toast had cooled completely. He ate it anyway, one slow bite at a time, chewing as though he had nowhere else to be, which, as far as anyone could tell, he didn't. Paula entered the breakfast room at 8:12, carrying a fresh basket of rolls. She placed them on the counter as though revealing them to an audience, then stepped back to check they were in the right position. Satisfied, he adjusted the serving tongs by a quarter turn, so the handles lined up with the edge of the table. No one noticed, but Paula always did this part. It was the most exciting thing that would happen to the tongs all day. Kenneth walked through the room, not speaking, just giving a slow nod to each table, like a priest doing blessings. When he reached the coffee machine, he pressed the button once, just to make sure it was still dispensing coffee, and then left without taking the cup. The businessman glanced at the untouched coffee, but didn't take it either. It didn't feel like it belonged to him. Out in the hallway, Arena and Morella's trolley could be heard squeaking faintly. They were making their way toward room 12, pausing outside each door long enough to listen for signs of life before moving on. When they passed the breakfast room, they nodded once toward Paula. Paula nodded back. It was not a greeting exactly, more of a confirmation that the day was proceeding as planned. Christy appeared briefly in the doorway from the kitchen, holding a pan, as though he had just remembered what he was supposed to be doing with it. He nodded to Paula, nodded to Kenneth retreating back, and went out again. Back in the breakfast room, Mr. Ellis returned to the toaster with the same slice of bread he had already eaten half of. He placed it back in and pressed the lever down, as though hoping it might turn into something more interesting the second time. Mrs. Finch watched this, then returned to stirring her tea, though there was nothing left in it to stir. The young couple attempted to spread jam evenly across a single roll, taking turns with the knife until it was covered perfectly. When they had finished, they sat back and looked at it for a moment before cutting it in half and swapping pieces the same way they had done yesterday and presumably the day before. The boy asked for another napkin, even though he hadn't spilled anything. Paula handed him one with the kind of calm pride usually reserved for handing over diplomas. He thanked her solemnly and immediately folded it into a small square before setting it in the middle of the table like a centerpiece. By 8:33, Mr. Ellis had finished his second round of toast inspected the plate to confirm it was empty, and stood up slowly, letting the chair scrape against the floor. He pushed the chair back under the table, but only halfway, just enough to let everyone know he would not be returning. He nodded once to Paula, who nodded back with the gravity of someone acknowledging a job well done. The Finches stayed several minutes longer, neither speaking, until Mrs. Finch finally said, "Tea?" Mr. Finch looked at the empty pot, then back at her and said, "No." They both stood at the same time, gathered their things, and left without another word. Angela passed them in the lobby and gave a single nod that could have meant anything from "good morning" to "safe travels." The young couple lingered the longest, finishing their muesli, one oat at a time. When they finally stood, they stacked their bowls neatly on top of each other, then hesitated, unsure whether they were allowed to carry them to the counter. After a long pause, they left the bowls where they were and walked out hand in hand, glancing back once, as though worried the bowls might feel abandoned. The businessman drained the last of his second coffee, opened his notebook again, drew a single line across the page, then shut it with a sense of completion. He left the room briskly, but not so briskly that anyone could accuse him of being in a hurry. The clock showed 8:49. The elderly lady finished last. She sat quietly for several minutes after her tea was gone, gazing out of the window, as though waiting for something to happen outside. Nothing did. Eventually, she patted her handbag again, stood up, and walked away with the slow confidence of someone who had no appointments for the rest of the day. The boy and his mother were the final ones to leave. He insisted on carrying his own plate to the counter, which took a very long time, because he stopped twice to balance it carefully in his hands. Paula accepted the plate with a solemn nod, as though receiving an offering, and placed it neatly on the stack. When the room was empty, Paula began her closing ritual. She wiped each table in turn, straightened the chairs so their backs lined up with mathematical precision, and gave the serving tongs another quarter turn, bringing them back to their original position. Kenneth reappeared just as she was finishing, surveyed the room with a slow, approving glance, and said, "Good." By 9:05, breakfast was officially over. The lobby was quiet again. The smell of coffee fading. The cups stacked. The tables reset. Somewhere upstairs, Arena and Morella's trolley squeaked twice and then fell silent, as if even the housekeeping had decided to take a short pause. The hotel had entered its favorite time of day, the part where nothing much happened at all. At 9:17, Kenneth began his rounds. This consisted of walking slowly through the lobby, glancing at the corners of the room to check they were still where they had been yesterday, and then heading down each corridor in turn. He didn't knock on any doors. He just listened to the hush of the hallway, nodded once to himself, and moved on. In the breakfast room, Paula stacked the last of the cups, paused to look at the arrangement, moved one half an inch to the left, and then nodded, satisfied. She switched off the coffee machine and got on with her day. Angela was behind the reception desk, sliding key cards back into their slots with quiet precision when a guest appeared. He was a man with a vaguely puzzled expression and a towel draped over his shoulder. "Shower's slow," he said. Angela nodded. The nod of someone who had heard this before, then wrote something down on a notepad that was already half filled with similar notes. She assured him it would be seen to, which in hotel language meant that Victor would be informed when he next wandered through. At 9:42, Victor appeared. He was carrying a screwdriver and a small bottle of oil, which suggested he was here for something mechanical, though it was never clear whether he was on his way to fix something, or had already fixed it, and was now just holding the tools for effect. Kenneth mentioned the slow shower. Victor nodded once, walked toward the stairs, and disappeared for 20 minutes before reappearing, nodding again, and putting the screwdriver back in his pocket. The shower, presumably, had been dealt with. At 10:05, the lobby plant received its weekly watering. Kenneth poured exactly the same amount of water he always poured, enough to keep the plant alive, but not enough to encourage unnecessary growth. He wiped one leaf with a tissue, stood back, and considered his work. It looked the same as before, which was the result he was hoping for. Somewhere upstairs, Irina and Morella could be heard opening and closing doors with the soft, regular rhythm of people who had perfected their routine. The trolley squeaked once on the way to room 14. Which was just enough to remind Kenneth that Victor would need to return later with the oil. At 11 o'clock, the lobby clock chimed faintly. Not because it was an especially important hour, but because that was what it did at 11 o'clock. Angela looked up from the computer, nodded to herself, and went back to doing whatever she had been doing before. The hotel, satisfied that the morning had gone entirely as expected, settled into its quietest stretch of the day. At 12:15, a delivery van pulled into the car park, its tires making a wet hiss across the puddles. Kenneth noticed it from the reception desk and stood for a full minute, hands on the counter, watching the rain drip off the mirrors of the van. When the driver came in, leaving faint footprints on the lobby floor, Kenneth handed him the pen from the chain and waited until the man had signed, before rotating the clipboard slowly to admire the neatness of the signature. In the kitchen, Christy lifted the lid on a simmering pot and let the steam rise slowly toward the extractor fan, before nodding once and replacing the lid. The rain tapped gently on the high window above the sink, forming thin streams that gathered and slid down in unhurried lines. At 12:42, the vending machine beeped twice, the sound unusually loud against the soft patter outside. Angela walked over, pressed the button herself, and stood for a moment, listening to the rain on the glass doors of the entrance, before nodding gravely and writing "crisps empty" on her pad. Victor was summoned. He crouched in front of the machine, tapped it gently until the packet fell, then placed it carefully on top and left without a word, his shoes leaving small, precise, wet marks on the floor by the door. The hours drifted past like the rain running down the windows. Every now and then, a guest crossed the lobby, pausing just long enough to shake a wet umbrella or glance at the puddles outside before heading back upstairs. At 1400, Kenneth polished the bell on the reception desk, then stood listening to the sound of water outside, before giving the bell a small, experimental tap. It rang once, a bright little note that sounded oddly cheerful against the muted day. Kenneth nodded, satisfied, and went back to straightening the stack of brochures by the door, which had curled slightly at the corners from the damp air. At 1410, in room 8, Mr. Ellis turned on the television and found the same soap opera he had been half watching the day before. He lay back on the bed, with his hands folded neatly on his stomach, watching in perfect silence. When a character on the screen shouted something dramatic, Mr. Ellis blinked once, slowly, then returned to staring at the screen. During the ad break, he considered getting up, sat forward slightly, then lay back down without moving further. When the episode ended, he stayed where he was for a full minute, watching the credits roll, before finally switching the television off and folding his arms with a quiet air of completion. At 1418 in room 10, Mrs. Finch put down her magazine and said, "Tea?" Mr. Finch nodded and watched as she plugged in the kettle. They sat in silence as the water boiled, then stirred their cups longer than necessary before taking their first sips. When they finished, Mr. Finch set his cup down exactly where the ring mark from yesterday's cup was, as if deliberately completing a pattern. At 1425, in room 15, the young couple stirred from their nap at the same time, as though cued by some invisible alarm clock. They lay on their backs, staring at the ceiling for a while, before one of them asked if they should go out. The other suggested they wait until later, and with that decision made, they both stayed exactly where they were, apparently content to let later decide for itself when it would arrive. At 1433, in room 18, the businessman finally typed 3 words into his laptop, read them, deleted them, and typed the same 3 words again. He leaned back in the chair, stared at the screen, as if waiting for it to produce a better idea, and then poured himself another cup of coffee, despite still having half of the first one left. At 1442, in room 21, the elderly lady wrote a single word in her crossword puzzle, then closed the book with great care and placed it on the bedside table at a perfect right angle. She sat quietly for several minutes, hands folded, looking at nothing in particular, then opened the puzzle book again and began a new clue with the air of someone settling in for a long afternoon. At 14:50, in room 24, the boy had lined up all the pillows from both beds along the floor to create a narrow obstacle course. His mother, while reading a leaflet, told him to be careful without looking up. He hopped from pillow to pillow twice before collapsing onto the carpet in a fit of laughter that lasted almost until 1500. At 15:05, in room 27, the older man switched on the television and found a nature program showing a heron standing completely still in a river. He sat watching the heron as though the two of them were in some kind of quiet contest. When the heron finally moved, he nodded once, satisfied, and turned the television off again. At 16:05, Mr. Ellis stood up from the bed, smoothed the duvet with both hands, and put on his cardigan. He opened the curtains half an inch more than they had been all day, looked out for a moment, and then left the room with the quiet purpose of a man going absolutely nowhere urgent. At 16:15, in room 10, Mrs. Finch began putting the magazines back into her bag in the order she had read them, while Mr. Finch folded the empty tea packet in half before dropping it in the bin. At 16:20, they both stood at exactly the same time, put on their coats, and left the room together without a word. At 16:28, in room 15, the young couple finally decided they might go downstairs just to see what's happening. They both put on shoes at the same time laces tied with matching levels of effort, and left the room looking faintly pleased with themselves. At 16:35 in room 18, the businessman closed his laptop with a faint but deliberate click and straightened the chair before leaving the room. He checked his watch twice on the way down the corridor, though there was nothing in particular to be on time for. At 16:43 in room 21, the elderly lady stood up, brushed off the skirt of her dress as if preparing for an inspection, and carefully tucked the crossword into her handbag. He locked the door with the steady hand of someone who knew she had left nothing behind, but checked anyway. At 16:52 in room 24, the boy had finally exhausted his pillow obstacle course and was now sitting cross-legged on the bed, staring at the blank television screen, as if willing it to turn on by itself. His mother stood, stretched, and announced it was time to go downstairs. The boy nodded once and leapt off the bed with enough enthusiasm to suggest this had been the plan all along. At 1700, in room 27, the older man stood, folded his hands behind his back, and gave the room a slow look, as though committing it to memory before leaving. He switched off the light, locked the door, and walked down the corridor so quietly. It was as if he had been part of the furniture all along. Downstairs, Paula had begun setting the tables for dinner, lining up the cutlery with the kind of precision that made it look more like a scientific experiment than a meal. Kenneth moved slowly through the lobby, straightening a chair by half an inch, then checking the time against the clock on the wall, as though confirming that the evening could now officially begin. At 17:35, the dining room had filled in its usual pattern, as if everyone had quietly agreed on which tables to sit at, without needing to discuss it. Mr. Ellis sat near the radiator, the Finches at the window table, the young couple opposite each other at the smallest table in the corner. The businessman was nearest the door, as though preparing for an early exit, and the elderly lady took the same seat she had used at breakfast. The boy and his mother sat in the middle. Paula moved between the tables with her usual steady pace, placing plates and collecting them again, with such quiet efficiency that she almost seemed to glide. By 1820, the dining room was empty again. Chairs pushed in, tables neatly reset. And now it was time for the evening. In the lobby, Kenneth sat at the desk with the reservation book open, running his fingers slowly down the page, as though counting something very important, even if there was nothing to count. Angela printed the day's receipts, stacked them in a tidy pile, and aligned them until the corners were perfectly flush. At 1835, Victor passed through the lobby, carrying a single light bulb, nodded to Kenneth, and went upstairs. 5 minutes later he returned, carrying the old bulb like a trophy, nodded again, and walked out of the building without speaking. Irina and Morella returned their squeaky trolley to the housekeeping closet and stood together for a moment, discussing the next day's order of rooms in low voices, as if rearranging the sequence might have unforeseen consequences. In the kitchen, Christy was washing the last pan at 1910, letting the water run over it until it made exactly the right sound, then hanging it carefully on its hook. He stood for a moment, looking at the row of hanging pans, nodded once, and switched off the light before leaving the kitchen in perfect order. At 1920, Kenneth walked a slow lap of the ground floor, pausing at each corridor to listen to the faint sounds of televisions and running water from the rooms above. Satisfied, he returned to the desk. By 8 o'clock in the evening, The corridors had gone quiet. Televisions glowed behind closed doors. The muffled sounds of game shows and weather reports seeping faintly into the hall. One by one, the guests settled in. Mr. Ellis folding his cardigan over the back of the chair. The Finches setting out their clothes for the next day. The young couple lying side by side, staring at the ceiling, as though waiting for it to say something. In the lobby, Kenneth switched off the overhead lights, leaving only the desk lamp burning. He closed the reservation book with a soft thud, stacked the pens neatly, and straightened the bowl of mints one last time. At 2100, Martin arrived for the night shift, nodded once, and accepted the keys and the day's notes with the quiet seriousness of a man receiving ancient instructions. Kenneth walked to the front door, checked that it was locked, then stood for a moment in the stillness of the lobby. Everything was in its place. He turned off the lamp, nodded to Martin, and left the soft sound of the door closing behind him, marking the official end of the day. At 21:15, Martin sat at the desk with a fresh cup of tea and opened the logbook to a blank page. He wrote the date at the top in slow, careful letters, then set the pen down and listened to the faint hum of the vending machine and the rain falling outside. Upstairs, each of the guests were preparing for sleep. Another day in the most boring